Well, how are you today there, Luke? I can see you on the screen. Nice smile on the face, which is nice to see.
Doing wonderfully well, mate. How are you?
Very well, thank you, mate. Okay. Now, Mirko, I've got to say, you put on a business shirt, and I cannot let that go unnoticed because half an hour ago you were not wearing a business shirt. So I'm throwing you under the bus right now.
Sometimes you need to take the advice of your daughter, and when she says, "Dad, you can't go live on air. You look like you've just been doing gardening," you've got to take that on board from your 17-year-old daughter and go, "All right, I'm putting a shirt on."
Probably very good advice, I dare say, Mirko. Now, gentlemen, we've got a lot to talk about this week, and I guess there hasn't been one particular theme that dominated the week, but rather a number of headlines which have been out there. And of course, what we hope to do today is pick apart all those headlines and open up the conversation to all of you online today. Before we get into the details, of course, a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this session today, and that will be available for those who aren't here on our website in the next day or so. Secondly, we are live today on social media, as we are making a habit of doing at this point in time. And I must advise you that today is a general advice forum, which simply means that the things that we discuss today are in fact general in nature. So if there are any specific relevant features or discussion topics that relate to your affairs, we'll pick that up with you offline. But on that note, Mirko, how have the stats looked this week?
Yeah, so we'll pick up the usual stats that we've got. So we're obviously interested in market stats and what's happening on both a global and Australian level. And also the same goes with COVID stats, both in Australia and overseas. If I can kick off with the COVID numbers, because Dan Andrews has now fallen into line with the rest of Australia and actually reports in the morning. So I can actually pick up nice graphics very early, as opposed to not being able to do so. But if we look at what's happening in the world right now, we've actually cracked over 20 million cases of COVID now, which is extraordinary when you think about the number, and 739,000 deaths. The US is still going along. I mean, 40,000 people is probably at a lower level than we've seen for them. It seems to have been between 50 and 60,000, but it sort of reverts to and fro. I think a bit of that's got to do with, whether it's a weekend, how much testing is being done and the like. We've seen, like, Brazil is now 3 million cases, India over 2 million cases. Brazil's had over 100,000 deaths now themselves. And these are those countries that we really worry about in terms of the infrastructure, health capabilities of being able to look after their citizens. In Australia, we've had 431 cases today reported, 410 out of those out of Victoria. So Victoria in a world of hurt when it comes down to the cases. If I'll make that a little bit bigger there so you can see it. You can see here, these are the daily numbers that we've been getting in Victoria. And even though we were, well into stage 3 of the restrictions, now into stage 4, we had a couple of days where we were coming off, got below 400, but today it spiked back to 410 cases. This chart sort of shows us the rocky road that we've had since July in Victoria. The testing has been consistent, which is good. So we've had pretty consistent numbers in daily tests, but we're continuing to sort of see these spikes, and until we start seeing these numbers get down, it's going to be a real battle here in Victoria. And as we know, you have 410 cases, but when you can't track them, or you have what they call mystery cases, it makes it very difficult. So New South Wales is another one I think is certainly worth being very cautious on and very mindful of, because they've had a couple of clusters of late where they've had a couple of schools shut down overnight and the like, and they would be pretty concerned out in New South Wales about this. So I think we need to continue to keep a very close eye on that, and hopefully the stage 4 that we've gone to here in Victoria is actually going to do the job, and we can actually start smashing this down. And because at this rate, where do we go from here is my question, if we can't nail this a lot better. So in terms of markets, jumping to the markets, I actually thought we were out of the US, we were going to have 5 trading days of green. I was pretty excited, but not to be. They let us down last night, down 0.38. Interesting end to the markets. Luke and I were talking about this before, and everything was going swimmingly well up until about 3 p.m. in the US, and then it sort of fell off a cliff. It dropped off about 400 points very quickly at the end of trade. So I'm not sure if that's sort of how that bodes for tonight's trade in the US, but nonetheless, 4 green days there. US was actually up about 3% for the week since we last spoke over the 5 trading days. All odds, bit of a mixed bag here. We're off a little bit today, and we've been up about 1.29 for the last week since we spoke last. If we look at the all odds as a graphical illustration, this is over the last 12 months. As you know, we where we were minus 37% on the 23rd of March, where we were coming off our high since the 20th of Feb. So since the 20th of February, we're off 13.9% during that period, despite being down 37. Interestingly enough, and just try and remember this, minus 6.37 in Australia for the all odds over the last 12 months. Okay, so we're now going back to August in 2019, and the market in general has been a negative 6 during that time. And back to my principles of mathematics that we spoke about probably 3 or 4 months ago now. It shows you how difficult it is to recover from such a significant loss. Like mathematically, if you lose 50% of your investment, you actually need 100% recovery to get back to where you started from. So if you started with 100,000, lost $50,000, you actually need 100% return to get back to 100. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is that I'm looking at it and I see that since the 23rd of March, since these lows, the Aussie market's actually come back 36.8%. Yet we're still 13% behind. So it shows you the magnitude of the recoupment you need to actually bounce back. I think that's important for investors to remember that. The other one I'd like to share with you, if I can get that up, is the Dow. Hopefully can you guys see the Dow graph? Give me a nod, boys. Yeah, great. Yeah, so looking at that, we look at over the last 12 months. Very different picture. If you pay attention to that, 12 months is actually a +6. We're at a -6 in the all odds, if you recall. So it's actually a 12% turnaround in the difference between the US and Australia. And if you ever wanted to have an understanding or a case for why you need to be invested in a diversified manner and in a manner that gives you access to different geographic locations, different asset classes, different parts of the economy. This is probably no better illustration. And I think that it's very important for us that we're not having this home bias with our investments. Just because we live in Australia doesn't mean that we should be fully invested in Australia only and ignore the rest of the world. As you can see, the Dow fared a lot better, down to since the highs of 20th of Feb, single digits, down -5, and then off the -37. So sort of paints two different pictures there. And I think that if you ever wanted to know why we all have headaches when we're thinking about investment markets, these are the things that we discuss in investment committee. And if you wanted to then take this further, which we do, is we now need to overlay this with currency as well. So it's one thing for the US market to do what it's doing, but then we need to take into account how is either an appreciating or depreciating currency in Australia behaving, and how do we implement that across our portfolios. And just before I go on, I did see this good little illustration, and I think it sort of touches on the notion of market timing and what missing the good days, missing the bad days actually means to an investor. So this graph that you see on your screen now shows you the last since '95, so the last 25 years of data for the all odds, and if you were just simply to remain fully invested, it would have been an experience of around an 8% mark, okay, over that period of time, an 8%. That's an annualized per annum rate. Versus if you missed the best days, okay, so the blue lines is I've now, as an investor, I've missed the best days. If I missed the top 10 best days, my return's only 6%. If I miss the top 40 days in that 25-year period, my return's only been 2.2% during that time. In terms of worst days, missing the worst days can certainly enhance your return. So if I was good enough to miss the worst 10 days during that period, my returns would be up 11 to 11%, up 3%. If I was able to miss the 40 worst days of the market over a 25-year period, which would make me a pretty impressive investor, my returns would actually be almost double at 15.8%. I think what this illustrates here is that how difficult it actually is to decide whether to be in or out of the market. And for us, it's always a case of we go back to basics, we look at your objectives, we look at the client, we look at how much exposure they actually need, and we do try and remain invested at the levels that are required on a client-by-client basis. But we also do appreciate and we do believe that staying invested and staying the course actually gets the job done. Despite all of the bumps and the like in the road, staying the course is important. And there are going to be times where, you're going to be questioning why it is that I didn't miss the worst day in the market, or, it's a shame that we weren't, invested in a greater extent in a good time. But I think it's a good way to sort of illustrate, what it means to be trying to time the market, which most people that worth their pinch of salt would actually say is actually impossible to do. And you might, out of the 40 occasions, you might pick up the 5 of them, fantastic. But what about the other 35 you missed, as an example? So a bit of food for thought there as investors, gives you a bit of an insight as to the way we think when we're constructing our portfolios as well. I'll throw back to yourself, Shane.
Thank you, Mirko. And as always, thank you for the stats. And I have to say, you used the reference before that we get headache at investment committee. I would call it probably no hair, mate. So that's probably an observation from my point of view. Now, look, gentlemen, we've got lots to talk about today. But before we jump onto some of those topics, what I thought there would be worthwhile doing now is a question that's come through in the chat room already, which says, what happens if after the 6 weeks the COVID numbers don't improve? Will we reopen the economy? And I guess that's a bit of a hypothetical scenario right now. I'll give you a second to think about it because I've had a thought about it. So look, from my point of view, I'm fearful of that because I don't know what next looks like and whether we can go hard or whether we can sustain stage 4 for longer. So, but in any case, if we don't get to a improved set of numbers, stage 4 retreating back to stage 2 probably doesn't feel the pathway. Maybe stage 4 retreating back to stage 3 or some sort of mesh of that. But what do you gentlemen think about that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If we can't get on top of this after a 6-week lockdown, do we bite the bullet and reopen the economy, or do we have to go to, as some of the memes said, stage 70 and stage 85 and whatnot? I mean, I think that we're doing the best we can given the current circumstances in terms of having to ramp things up. The only problem we've got now is that the people that aren't actually following suit and actually abiding by the rules are the ones that are going to jeopardize this. And we've seen some live examples of this already, and it's only going to be ourselves that actually makes this come undone. Like, the reality is that we know that how we can stop community transmission, but are we as a community, as a collective, prepared to do that? Now, if we're still seeing numbers of 300, 400, 500 a day in Victoria in 6 weeks' time, I'd be stunned if they were to open up the economy. I dare say, given the playbook so far, you'd think we'd go to another level of lockdown. That's my belief.
Look, I think businesses and people and we all as society, we're facing the very extreme choice between economic and biological survival. And whilst we're facing that choice, what is the right answer? For mine, this is something that I've pondered for many a night, trying to figure out what happens next. I think the biggest issue is the economic survival. As much as the biological survival is important, so too is the economic survival. And I think we actually have the solution in terms of being able to work with COVID, as opposed to not have it here. Obviously, if we had a vaccine, it's all fixed. But in the absence of that vaccine, I think we have to work with it. And in working with it, things that we are doing, i.e., physical isolation or isolating from one another, wearing face masks, maintaining good hygiene and all those sorts of things. I think these will become the standard norms. And I think we're just going to have to start to accept that there'll be certain parts of our society that won't return the way we thought they would return. And we'll need to take extra precautions with those who are most vulnerable. I think that's the reality of where the market will be in 6 weeks' time. Extending it beyond, I don't know what you can do beyond this, Mirko, in terms of going any further. I don't know, I don't know if society's prepared to do that, and I don't know if human beings are prepared to do that. And we're seeing that now. And to Victoria's credit, seeing the empty roads at 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night, and seeing people doing the right things and people wearing masks during the day and so on. Credit to the state, absolute credit to each individual that's doing it. But invariably, you've still got a small percentage, albeit small and minor, that will not follow the rules. And the reality is, I think, whilst we have these issues and whilst we open our borders again, this is going to be a recurring problem.
And I think that's going to strike at the very crossroad, isn't it, of economic recovery versus health, because it's that minority that's still driving the hospitalisations and causing issues in that regard. But if anyone else has got a view on that, by all means, please share it into the chat room. Of course, no one knows the answer to this, so it's all hypothetical at this stage. And I think Daniel Andrews has pressed on this very point in his press release today, and he openly said, "I have no idea what happens next." He said, I maintain the view that if everyone does the right thing and makes the right choices consistently, that we will actually come out after this lockdown in a better shape for it.
I think the reality is, and this is where we should take a lot of solace, in the sense that businesses have adapted and people are adapting, and we're finding ways to work, and we're finding ways for this to be the new normal. So in our adaptations and so on, we'll be okay. And so I do think the economy will open. I don't know if it'll open as in on every cylinder, Mirko. So if we're a 6-cylinder car, we won't have 6 spark plugs going. We might only have 4, as an example. And the notion of going to the pub and the notion of going to a cafe like we would have in the past, that's going to be really different because we won't be sitting together in close proximities and so on, which has its advantages too, because there was nothing annoying about going into a cafe where they made you sit on top of each other and you actually had no room to eat.
Hey, Luke, we don't have to hang out with Mirko. It's kind of cool, mate.
Absolutely. So from that point of view, like I said, I think, but the notion of, do we just keep on extending this lockdown into perpetuity? No, that's not feasible. Society will riot. And look, let's not forget, we're human beings. We need interaction. We need intimacy. We need touch. We need feel. We need those sort of things. And you rob us of all that, there's nothing left. In truth. Now, obviously, with death and so on, we've got to manage that. But I think we've just got to learn to manage these things.
And I think, Luke, to that point, the comment that's come through here is that the longer stage 4 goes for, the other health issues become more pronounced. The untreated health illnesses that we've talked about, a few times in this forum. But also the mental health side of things, which is a real travesty at this point. And you're seeing money continually be poured into mental health from the government, which one suggests that probably been underfunded for some time. But there was a stat that I heard on the weekend from the government in their press release, and it said the presentations at Melbourne hospitals for self-harm have increased by 10% in the comparable period to last year. That self-harm attempts, and 25% increase in mental health presentations at hospital. And they're extraordinary numbers, and I think this is kind of the dichotomy that we find, isn't it, today, in that there is these different parts of the decision-making process that are all combining together at the same time, which makes it an extraordinarily challenging decision to make.
Yeah, look, I think you're right there. I think the other problem there is too, we've also had a lot of people who aren't looking after themselves in terms of self-care, about getting their blood pressures checked and their whatever it might be from that point of view. And all of a sudden, we all know that if you find something very early on in the piece, the chances of recovery are very good. Unfortunately, kicking the can down the road and not getting those checks. So these are the unintended consequences as well. So not only is it just health, it's also physical. And this is the challenge for us as a society to sit back and go, well, what's right and what's reasonable? And unfortunately, You know, we're watching the media now having an argument about whether or not the ADF was offered to Daniel Andrews or not, and so on. And you know, they're asking wrong questions. The questions aren't that. The questions are around why did you make the decisions that you made, and in truth, by making those decisions, what are the ramifications of those decisions? You know, so what are the unintended consequences, and what are we doing? And look, one thing that's clear about mental health, you can throw as much money as you want at this. Ultimately, if it's under-resourced and it doesn't have the resources, mental health is enormously critical, and it requires a lot of time. This is not a take a magic pill and we fix it. This is not we drop $1 million into it and it's resolved. It requires a lot of work and effort, and we've come into this crisis completely underprepared, firstly, and we're now dealing with the ramifications of it. Unfortunately, we are going to lose a lot of people because of this. And that's the reality of this. And I guess the thing that we've got to ask ourselves is, when the next pandemic happens, do we want to make sure that that happens again, or would we like to avoid it? And you'd like to think it'd be the latter.
It gets you to start thinking about it and sort of saying, is COVID actually the least of our problems, given the other issues? Because I think some of the issues around mental health and the like are generational issues. You don't turn these on and off. This is not 14 days of quarantine and you're back out. This is actually, you know, long-term stuff.
I think that's an extraordinary insight, Nick. And I think in terms of the question that you've asked is, you know, and there's an article that we'll explore with our listeners today from the Rolling Stone in terms of, you know, is America dwindling? And the reality is, I think the questions that we should be asking ourselves is, what sort of society do we want to be? Or what sort of society are we? And what's right and what's wrong? And is it about profit? Is it about the economic outcome? Or is there a combination of the two things? And I think what we've found is COVID has highlighted is that we, as a society, became incredibly underprepared, as we were with face masks. Like, we didn't have face masks in March. You know, we didn't have PPE equipment. So one of the reasons why we had to close down the first time was just to replenish stock. You know, so we're incredibly not ready for what's going on. So, you know, I think your insight there is, you know, is a fair question, and that's, I would love to have that conversation. I think, you know, if we had that conversation, if we had politicians who would frame that and lead it, and we've had a media who supported that and allowed people to allowed the community to put their own views into it, I have no doubt that we'd come out fundamentally way better than where we are today. But you know, we can always hope.
Well, I think, gents, the thought of a societal discussion is probably a good segue into the US at this point in time. And of course, there's been quite a few things happen over there in the last 24 hours, particularly with Joe Biden announcing Kamala Harris as his vice president. So that's the first time that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, a woman of colour who is Asian American background has been into vice president. So it's very cool. I think the fact that there's a female, you know, nipping at his heels in the first instance. So, you know, who knows, this might actually result in the first female president of America as well in time.
I think the interesting thing there with Kamala Harris, and obviously, you know, we've been watching from the sidelines. Donald Trump has made a point of wanting to argue this election on two fronts. One being the strength of the economy, and two, actually the strength of Wall Street, not the economy, the strength of Wall Street. So that's the first point. And the second point, really firm on law and order. And his response to the issues at Lafayette Square in Washington, and his response in Portland, and then his response, you know, all over the country in terms of that. So he's been very firm on that. Someone like Kamala Harris comes from a law enforcement background, and she's got a very big agenda and very, very forceful in that area. So that'll help to, I guess, nullify that attack that Trump might have on Biden. But, you know, I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves here about Kamala Harris is, you know, is she realistically the next president of the United States if Joe Biden was to be elected? Because, you know, the reality is, will Joe Biden be able to serve a full term? Which, you know, we hope he can. If he was to win, that'd be great. Will he be able to serve it? And if he can't, then obviously Kamala Harris is the new president of the United States. So we could have a black Asian American woman running the world, which is awesome. But something that, very different to what we would have thought 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, one of the interesting things I read, I was just going to say, on the announcement, we all know that US elections are about cash and how much money you can, raise, to run your campaign. And after that announcement, over the next 4 hours, there was $10.8 million poured into the Act Blue Fund, which is their major vehicle for fundraising, versus about 2.3 million over a 4-hour period the day before. So. It seems that it's certainly a popular choice, and Biden may have picked well there.
Yeah, let's hope so. And look, Luke, you and I were discussing earlier today too that perhaps a safe set of hands and a steady ship in Washington is exactly what America needs right now, given that they're imploding on all fronts. And Kamala Harris perhaps is a great supporter to Biden in that regard.
And I think,
Luke, you had some comments before, and I think it'd be interesting to share with the audience what we spoke about earlier from your perspective with your view on Biden in terms of exactly how it might be what America needs today.
Yeah, look, it was just something, on one of your many walks, as you can only do for an hour now in Victoria, but on one of your many walks, and as you're wandering around thinking and trying to understand things, the thing that came to mind was, we as children feel safest when we're in the hands of somebody who we respect, i.e. a father or a grandfather. And somebody like a Biden potentially could be that sort of a character. So if we use the analogy of America being the child and Biden potentially being a safe pair of hands or a grandfather type figure, maybe that's what America needs after the last 4 years in terms of what they've had. And it's not necessarily the last 4 years of Trump, because I don't think that's fair on Trump. I think he's actually done some reasonably okay things in saying that. He's done some poor things, but he's done some okay things. But I think the last 20 years of the US state, where they've become so polarized and the argument has become so stupid and so flippant, I think from that point of view, maybe somebody like a Joe Biden now at this moment in time is time for America to take pause, to feel the embrace of somebody who's not going to rock the ship, so to speak, and allow them time to heal and then hopefully reset and go forward. Because I think the world definitely needs a stronger United States, not a weaker United States.
Definitely. We'll all be better for it if that's the case. And I've got a couple of stats, Luke. You mentioned before that Rolling Stone article, and perhaps it's something we should share with everyone after this discussion.
Absolutely.
But and I must confess, it hasn't been fact-checked, this particular stat. But someone has gone to the effort of counting all the lies and the half-truths that Donald Trump has spoken. And up until the 10th of July, since the commencement of his presidency, 20,055 lies apparently he's told. So, or stretching of the truth, which is quite an extraordinary, A, that someone had the time to do that, and B, that's the actual outcome.
And so, Shane's worried about fact-checking. This bloke stole 20,000 curly ones. He's worried about fact-checking.
Well, I'm a nerd at heart, Nick. I can't help myself.
I love it.
In any case, but gents, I think we should shift on a little bit in terms of some of the other topics, and perhaps we can circle back to that Rolling Stone article later on, which is worth a good discussion in itself. But this week obviously brings us the start of reporting season here in Australia, and Mick, I know you've been quite vocal over the last sort of month or so, right through these pulse checks about the more information that we have, the better we are in a position to make decisions and understand where things sit. And I guess right now we're probably starting to see a little bit of the information emerge, particularly with the CBA reporting earlier today. What was I guess the key output from the CBA earlier today, Mirko?
Yeah, so CBA is probably one that everyone's been waiting on, because the first of the banks to start reporting, particularly around the dividend notion. CBA have opted to pay a dividend. They're actually going to pay a 98 cent dividend, which is a bit of a surprise, given that they paid the full tote back in March before the actual pandemic broke in the scale that it did. And like the same time last year, they paid $2.31. Let's not forget that. Yeah. So look, on the one front, there'll be a lot of investors that are pleased that, there's a lot of mum and dad investors holding CBA. There's a lot of super funds that hold CBA. We're pleased that they're seeing a dividend. I noticed that they have pushed the envelope as far as APRA's direction is concerned. APRA said, you can pay up to 50% of your statutory earnings as dividends. That's exactly what they've done. They've gone the full 50%. And a lot. It's interesting. You look at a lot of the reports that come out, and it's the way you market your results that come through. So in the CBA case, it sort of says, we made a profit. But that was off the back of selling a fair few assets as well. But in terms of their cash profit, that's actually down like 11%. Over that same period, down to still they aren't going broke anytime soon. Their cash profit's 7.3 billion. I remember doing client presentations 15 years ago, and used to be able to say about our big four banks in terms of how important it is that we have robust banks. And I sort of reflect on some of these presentations we've done. And I used to say, don't worry, we know that there will be a B in the number. And we were saying, how strong are our banks? They've made over $1 billion of profit. These guys have come off 11% and they're still at 7 billion. So it does show strength from that point of view. They've increased their view on impairments on loans. So that gives us a bit of an insight into sort of the future direction as well. They know how many loans they've had deferred on their books and the like. So the CBA is a big home lender. Yeah. So that's something that we pay attention to. But all in all, the market is not too displeased with what they've done. I think they're off 0.5% today, which is sort of in line with the market. But they are paying some form of dividend. The choice was they didn't pay a 0.1. I think that. It maybe not so much an ethical question, but just something to reflect on. And we spoke about this earlier this morning over coffee, and that was, is it right that the dividend is actually being paid? Is it actually prudent to be paying the dividend? And the answer can be seen on two fronts. One, the point of view, the real cynic in me saying, well, of course they're going to pay a dividend. They need to prop up the share price, because how do the executives get rewarded? Right? How do they manage to see all their options in and the like? Right? That's the real cynic in me. On the other hand, though, it's the mums and dads that actually are rewarded by the dividends as well, and they're desperate for the income as well. So it's a real juggling act on that front. But the reporting season, and we pay close attention, particularly over the next week. There's a fair bit of solid reporting going on. We pay attention to give us an insight into those businesses and an insight into what their view of the world is going forward as well. Now, a lot of it's got to be interpreted inside the language on their announcements.
Given the rise in impairments, Mirko, I guess the question that I would ask is the bank being responsible? Because if they've raised their impairments by $1.52 billion, and what that essentially means for the benefit of our listeners is they're saying that's an expectation that there's going to be a number of bad loans coming on board, and essentially the assets they may be holding aren't as valuable as they used to be from that point of view.
Yeah.
So that's a concern. So, have the directors and has the board been short-sighted, despite the fact that, don't get me wrong, as investors and as people who are allocating money and so on, we obviously want the bank to be paying dividends because that adds to the return and so on. So we all get that, and people are relying on the bank to provide an income stream. But what they have done is they've gone to absolute town on retirees in particular in terms of savings accounts. Like, savings accounts are now negligible. They haven't had the audacity to charge people for having money in the bank, but it won't be long, I don't think. So you've got that thing in order to ensure that the dividends can continue to flow and that the directors can continue to receive their bonuses. You just kind of sit there and go, is that one of the reasons why we're in the mess we're in now, because of that sort of behaviour?
Yeah, look, I think it's a valid point. I think whether they're being prudent, I think APRA will be the biggest judge of the prudence from that point of view. But it's interesting, if they said you can pay up to 50%, why not pay 30? Right? If they decided, no, we'll go to 50. From that point of view, the impairments that they've budgeted for. In truth, the fourth quarter impairments that they're looking at are in line with previous years as well. So they're not. I think all of the massive impairments that CBA came up with were the last two quarters, and now they've forecasted the others into the 1.5, 1.6. but that is actually in line with what previous years when we didn't have a COVID scenario going on. So maybe they overshot the mark initially as well, in terms of that. But but when you extend the deferments by an additional, 4 months that they're talking about, I always worry about that doesn't reflect well on the change in the impairments that are actually being positioned. Like, the simple mathematics in my world is that if you've had all these deferments and now you've kicked the can down the road 4 months, it's not because a whole heap of deferments have pulled back. It's because people actually need the extension. So it'd be interesting to see how what they perceive will be happening in Q4 resonates when we get into 2021.
And I think also too, we will be interested to see what the other banks have to say as well, because CBA probably have been the stronger of the big four for the last little while. So it'll be fascinating to see what Westpac, ANZ and NAB have to say about their positions. And also noting as well, for the benefit of everyone, the banks have their own niches in terms of where they lend as well. So that impairment number may very well be a little bit different across banks based on the type of businesses that they bank and the type of households that they bank as well. So the full picture will come out, I think, in the days ahead. But gents, one of the things that we actually talked about today, one of our listeners on social media have also picked up, is that some of perhaps of the poor corporate behaviour we've seen with JobKeeper, and I'm going to call out Adairs here as the first one. It's pretty disheartening to see companies the way they've kind of, I wouldn't say, maybe it would say bend the rules in terms of the JobKeeper piece, and then use that as a positivity for their shareholders. Doesn't bode well for corporate Australia, I feel.
Look, I would, every single one of those companies like Adairs, Scully, 130 or 1300 Smiles, whoever, who've actually relied on the likes of JobKeeper to then fluff up their bank holdings so they could therefore then go out and pay increased dividends and increase the wages of their management teams and so on. I hope they hang their heads in shame. And if I was Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, I would be knocking on their door and auditing the crap out of them. And after I audited the crap out of them, I'd take every cent that they took from the Australian people and take it back. These are gutter rats. They don't deserve to exist because it's shit behaviour like that that gets us into the predicament we're in today. Even the audacity for them to even report. How dare you? How dare you report? You know what? The good news is they don't sit in our portfolios, and nor should they. Because if they did, I wouldn't be investing in them, because they're just not the right kind of. If they're going to do that normally, imagine what they're going to do on other times.
And especially to hang out there and say we've increased our dividend as well, which is, you think really, and you look at their earnings, they had poor earnings for a short period of time and then had really strong earnings after that. And paid all that money out to shareholders, which I dare say a fair chunk of their shareholders are in fact their executives.
The scary part is it's amazing how, like, I was reading the Australian Financial Review and I read the Australian as well, and they were reporting on this, and the reporter made it sound like there wasn't anything wrong with what they were doing. And it's bizarre, if you keep on accepting rubbish, it becomes normal. And that's, I think we as a society have just got used to that. And I think what we need to do is start calling this crap out. That sort of behaviour is intolerable. And I would love to see something like Josh Frydenberg or Scott Morrison and go, hey, no, crap, hand it back. And you know what? If it sends the company broke, good. Good, because, I'm looking at these small businesses out here on the street who are trying their best to survive on a day-to-day basis. They're not doing that.
Well, the interesting thing is the mentality of a lot of the small to medium businesses is actually put myself at the back of the queue to try and ensure that my staff can retain their jobs, to try and ensure they can keep a roof over their heads, buy their groceries, et cetera, versus how do we line our pockets and take advantage of the situation? And look, you need to be careful, mate. Where are you going to go and buy your homewares in Manchester if you get black banned by Adairs?
Couldn't give a rat's ass. I won't be buying them from Adairs anymore, let me tell you.
I can see, Shane, can you see Luke walking through Adairs just feeling the texture of the bath towels to make sure he's happy with what he's buying?
I can just imagine that, Mirko.
It's just poor.
And on his way to Nick
behaviour.
Scali, he did the same thing afterwards.
Yeah, that's right. The furniture guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not good.
So look, it's certainly disappointing. And look, I think your point before was absolutely spot on. It'd be nice to see Frydenberg call it out in the media to start with, and then send the ATO and the hounds in to make sure that there aren't any cracks in the business, because they should rip them apart if there are.
You know what my biggest fear is, Shane, and this is the point. Sometimes when you're too big, the ATO and all those kind of stuff and all the powers that be, it's too hard. So what they end up doing is going for the smaller guy. And the smaller guy is trying to do the right thing in most cases, or the medium-sized guy. And that's the thing that sucks about this whole thing. You always go for the lowest hanging fruit. You got guys here waving the flag in front of you, taking the mickey out of you. You know, for God's sake, you know. If you ever needed an excuse, and I reckon the Australian public would actually welcome it. You know, standing up to these guys and going, enough's enough. Do the right thing, for God's sake.
We'll talk about not learning from lessons of the past. Talk about watching the DVD again. We did this in the GFC. You know, the bank, particularly out of the US, the bank's too big to fail, and you know, being propped up, and all of a sudden everyone's paying themselves bonuses. It's just incredible, you know. And this behaviour continues and continues. And like you said, Luke, it doesn't get called out.
No, it doesn't. No, and that's the thing. You know, it's sad. It's sad because I think then all of a sudden we started having discussions around, well, how many dead people is okay? You know, if we called things out and we actually stood by our convictions and by our values, we wouldn't be saying dead people are okay. We'd be trying to work at a basis of trying to how do we make sure that the most people stay safe and the economy can still function. But when you put profit in front of everything else, all of a sudden dead people and the numbers are okay. No, it's not.
No, I think this point, Luke, probably is a good segue into the Rolling Stone article in a way, right? Because what we're seeing in the US is exactly that: corporate greed and money driving decision-making processes. And here's a stat that came out of this particular article: the three wealthiest Americans have more money than the poorest 160 million Americans. So that's three individuals have more collective wealth than 160 million of the poorest Americans, which is, that divide is so significant. And I think that's certainly some of this behaviour we're seeing with, you know, albeit a very different context, with Adair's reporting an increase in profit on government stimulus, increase in dividend rather on government stimulus. But that behaviour that drives greed, I think, isn't it, in a way where we're seeing that certainly ravage America right at this point in time.
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing it ravage America. I think we're seeing it ravaging actually most of the world, in truth, Shane, and that's probably the sad part about it, in the sense that I think the reality is, you know, if we think back to the old days of General Electric or GE, so to speak, and amazing leaders like Jack Welch, as an example, and in those days it was common for the CEO to earn 20% or 20% more, or 20 times more than what the lowest paid person was earning in the company. Today, we're seeing that at 400, 500 times. And this is not just an American phenomenon. This is across Europe. This is across Australia, across Asia, across everywhere. And that value set has been lost. And the reality is, I think we're in the predicament now. And I think what COVID's doing is COVID's forcing us to have this discussion. And he's saying, is it right? And it's not to say that it's wrong or it's right or whatever. But the fact that there's so many angry people tells me that maybe it's not right. And maybe we need to revisit it. But for the benefit of our listeners, this Rolling Stone article, which we will share with all of you at the end of today's session, from that point of view, and do yourself a favour. It's an essay which appeared. It is wonderfully, wonderfully written, and it just speaks of where we are in the world and why we're in this current predicament. It's not a left article. It's not a right article. It's something which tries to focus in on facts. It does put a point of saying that Canada is doing okay, which, you know, you kind of do laugh a bit.
It was written by a Canadian, so that was always an interesting angle.
Well, it was always going to come out. But in saying it, like, I know I read it, and then I shared it with the team and all that kind of stuff, and everyone who sat back and read it, it has inspired debate. It has caused conversation in the office, which has been fantastic. So do yourself a favour, read it. The learnings from it, I think, are extraordinary, and it's 10 minutes of your time. Given that we are in lockdown, it's 10 minutes well spent, I think.
Indeed. Now, gents, we saw, and there's a comment that's come through in the chat room here earlier about a vaccine, and it seems as though there is a lot of a bit more momentum around a vaccine taking place at the moment. And the comment in the chat room, I think, is a good one about Russia coming to the party first and foremost to say they've got the vaccine, and the market hasn't changed at all based on that announcement. And I think it probably shows or strikes the credibility of Russia, dare I say, and Vladimir's desire to be out there and this vaccine probably isn't even a real in his world. But on a different note, there has been a lot of positivity, and even listening to Brett Sutton yesterday in the parliamentary inquiry, he was speaking very glowingly about the prospects of a vaccine in the foreseeable future, but still noting that we're still 12, 18 months potentially before it can be administered.
I think the interesting thing there is the last vaccine that we created was for the mumps, and that took 4 years to resolve that. Now, obviously, human intelligence and genius and so on will obviously frame that a lot shorter. Technology will obviously help to frame that a lot shorter, but I think the reality is we are 12 to 18 months away. One thing I will say on Putin, and I want to call BS on this, which man in any sort of decency says we've discovered a vaccine and tested it on his child and not himself? Okay, this is not a normal human being. Okay, because most parents that I've met in my life would take their own life before their child. The fact that he's going out there promoting the fact that he gave it to his daughter and not to himself, my God, this world is being run by a bunch of lunatics.
Well, you could be of the same ilk of China, Luke, who also believe they've got a successful trial of vaccine, and they've administered that trial to the army. So probably indicates a little bit where their headspace is at, in that they're giving their army the healthiest chance of survival rather than the people first and foremost. If it doesn't work, then the army just have 2 heads and 4 arms, so they're even more powerful. So it's a win-win. So.
You know what I've found interesting is the country behaviours around the vaccine, and I would have thought that in the circumstances that we're in, that we could create an environment where the smartest people, the best technology, the best analytics, the best computer programs are actually shared so that we can actually get a result quicker. Yet what we're reading is that companies are basically being seconded and said, we are buying all of your supply. So if you're the one that ends up, so there's, like, Australia's doing the same thing. They've got they find themselves no choice. They're going to get left behind. So they're putting their hand up saying, we're going to order 1 million vials of your vaccine that hasn't actually been created yet. Right? Let's be frank, so that we don't miss out. The US Trump has done this with a couple of the big pharmaceutical companies, where he said, we're taking all your stock, whatever it is, we're going to take it off your hands. It's interesting, the dynamic that actually is occurring. And I watch this debate with plenty of interest, as opposed to sort of a situation where we're actually saying this is actually a world issue. We're trying to get a global solution. I don't think so.
I think that's just symbolic of where we are as a world at this moment in time, Mirko, in the sense that in the absence of a global leader, in the absence of somebody who could actually lead and unite, and that's the art of leadership. The art of leadership is being able to turn on the light of the darkest moment and to provide a pathway forward. And unfortunately, we don't have that today in the world. And when you don't have that in the world and you're fearful for your own existence, you start to respond the way we're seeing people respond now. So nations are working for themselves, very much about themselves. And if you actually remove that from the nations and you go back to corporates and you say, well, corporates are doing the same thing. If you then look at the anti-vaxxers are doing the same thing. So this is shambolic of where we are as a thing. And I think, I think what it requires, and I'm a firm believer in this, is for too long the silent majority, and I think the silent majority are all normal, good, decent people, but the silent majority needs to stand up and say enough of this crap, and call the BS and say, well, hang on a sec, we need to work together collectively. Because one thing we do know, that when we do work collectively and when we work together, the ability to find solutions, the ability to find outcomes, and the pathway forward is so much easier. But at this moment in time, if we think about where we are today, What's happening in the world, and your summation there, Mirko, is happening at a corporate level and happening at an individual level. And
I think if you can, to add to that, Luke, I mean, I think, Mick, you made a point last week where you talked about the likes of India, Brazil, South America more broadly, Indonesia. When it comes to a vaccine, these poorer countries will be left well behind, which is a travesty, because that number that we see, COVID stats and infections, will continue to rise until that corporate leader or that a leader somewhere in the world, Luke, stands up and says, no, we're all in this together and we are actually going to support one another across countries, and perhaps this is the time where a leader can define themselves and put their own stamp on history if they're able to do that.
The world desperately needs, and I'm not suggesting that this would be the case, so please don't yell at me for the people or our listeners, but if we think about what Winston Churchill was in World War II and his ability to bring together the Allies, and obviously with the input of America and so on, had it not been for the Americans, that war would have been very different. But his ability to bring forces together to take on what was the one common enemy, i.e. the Nazi regime, the world is sadly lacking that today, in truth. And I'm not saying that we should have another Churchill by any stretch, but that sort of a character, that type of individual, is being missed to a large degree. And look, it's not to say that there's no hope that it won't emerge. But if we think about the way the information's being fed to society and so on, there isn't much hope there, in truth, from that point of view. Because if we just watch the media spin on all this sort of stuff, we're not even talking about the things that matter. We're talking about fluffy things, which makes no sense to anyone.
And one of the things I was just going to say, Shane, one of the things that I won't tolerate is this notion of, this virus does not discriminate. You know what? It actually does. It'll discriminate based on where you live, what your demographic is, what your access to resources are. It's going to discriminate, and we're going to see this play out. Right? And that's why, Shane, to your point, we pay attention to some of those numbers in those underdeveloped countries, because we know how that DVD ends. Right? And that's why you sort of look at it and go, well, yeah, so why is it that a country might buy up the entire vaccine available?
But even there, like if you think about America of the past as an example, so if you think about the great leaders of our time and so on, so someone like Donald Trump makes a point of telling the American people about, I've gone out and bought all the vaccine for this particular medication at the expense of the rest of the world. Whereas past American leaders, I'm not saying all, but past American leaders, you would like to think may have turned around and said, well, I won't buy it all. Where does it need to be deployed? And in which areas are they struggling with? So, for example, somewhere like a Brazil where it's got completely out of control, do we actually hand it out to the Brazilians and give them a chance to perhaps reset and so on? So, these are, I think one of the questions, and I just noticed there was one of the questions that came through about, how do we stop this? How do we, other than, corporate greed and so on? I think we as investors have a really big role to play in all this. Some of the decisions we make as to where we deploy capital is just that. If we're seeing that there are companies and there are societies that make no sense, we shouldn't be deploying capital to those areas. But that's not one person making a stance. That's the collective making a stance. Because we can only change this through a collective. We can't change this by one. But remember, it took one person to stand up in the bus in the United, or to sit down in the bus and refuse to stand up. I think it was Martha Parks, who refused to stand up in the United States, who actually brought the civil rights movement. Okay, so it took one person. So that's where it starts, through one action. But it needs to be a global one action rather than just a one person action.
And probably the same can be said with our media too. I mean, we've harped on our media at length in this very forum, and their irresponsibleness with their reporting is just unbelievable, I feel. And it becomes very hard to have faith in what we're hearing on the news and reading in the press when you have no idea as to the agenda behind the person writing that particular article.
I think the sadness there, Shane, is that the media's role is to frame the conversation. Okay, but the media has assumed that we're all idiots. The media is hell-bent on pushing forward through a particular agenda that they want to do. The quicker the world is rid of Rupert Murdoch, the better it will be. Well,
I won't comment there, Luke, but I will change topics slightly, gents. On a more dour note, I guess, last night we all read, and I'm sure everyone in this forum read, that New Zealand have had their first COVID cases for some time, and I thought it was a kind of a very stark reminder that the virus, even if you can't, if lucky enough to eradicate, still present because it can still, eclipse. And I think it's a good lesson for our other states in Australia, for Western Australia and Queensland particularly, who are kind of very vocal about their stance, is to just acknowledge that it's still real, right? It's still a very real force in the world, sadly.
Yeah.
I was going to say, looking at what happened out of New Zealand, it's again, you look at the media and the treatment of people and leaders, and Jacinda Ardern's made it come out and said this is how we're doing it, and her leadership's been fantastic. You can't question it. It's been very decisive, swift action, and the message has always been, well, this is what we've been preparing for. We hoped this wouldn't happen after 102 days, I think it is, but it has, and this is how we're dealing with it, which is great. Yet the media were, pretty much, burning her at the stake when she was shutting her country down.
I think her response has been extraordinary in terms of the one thing that is really nice, and maybe because we don't hear her as often, and maybe that's the benefit of that, but listening to her last night and listening to her rationale and her reasonings behind what she was doing, it was very clear. It was well articulated. There was cause behind it. I desperately feel sorry for the Kiwis. In the truth, they've done the hard job of what appeared to be eradication. I guess what it does raise is the question: is this pursuit of complete eradication feasible, or does this disease exist underneath rocks and we don't understand it, and it then reappears again? So if we think about the lockdown in terms of where we are today in Victoria, could all this be in vain? Yes, we might eradicate, but what does that mean? Does that mean in 6 weeks' time we could be back in the same spot again? So these are the questions that I guess that we need to ask. But in saying that, I think in fairness, this is an evolving crisis, and the governments of the day are trying their best to deal with what is a really tough one out there. So it's tough.
Indeed. Well, gents, I think it's probably a good chance there to wrap up. And as we said at the outset today, there hasn't been a particular theme or item for the week, but there's been a lot of things happening in the week, and it's been a good chance to have a good discussion about that with everyone. And thank you for everyone who's contributed in the audience today. So on that note, we bid you all well, and please keep safe and healthy, and we look forward to you joining us again next Wednesday at 12:30. Take care and bye for now.
See you guys. Be safe.